Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are connecting from. Thank you so much for coming. First, allow me to appreciate the distinguished participant for joining us today at the virtual seminar. It is our pleasure to introduce the program of this meeting, which was also circulated to you through the email that you have already received. After my introduction, the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran will make a short welcoming and statement and opening remarks. Before the statements, we will listen to the remarks of the keynote speaker, Mrs. Alina Duham, Special Rapporteur of the Negative Impacts of the Unilateral Coercive Measures on the Enjoyment of Human Rights, and Dr. Carlos Maria Correa, Executive Director of the South Center. Then the organizer of these seminars will deliver their short statements in alphabetical order. Afterwards, the keynote speakers as well as the organizer statements, the distinguished ambassador and representative of 14 countries who already registered to make a statement will have the opportunity in alphabetical order of the names of the country to intervene in 3 parts. At the end, also, if time permits, the floor will be open for those distinguished participants who wish to make a short intervention. We kindly request that speakers keep their statements within the minimum of 5 minutes as much. Before the closure of this virtual seminar, the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of Cuba will read the joint communique, which has gained so far the support of 16 countries. Now, I would like to invite His Excellency Ambassador Gharib Abadi, permanent representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, for a welcoming and opening statement. Ambassador Gharib Abadi, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Dalila. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ms. Alina Duhan, Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, Dr. Carlos Maria Correa, Executive Director of the South Center, distinguished ambassadors, dear colleagues. It is a distinct honor for me to welcome you to this virtual seminar on behalf of the permanent missions of the Republic of Cuba, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. We are honored and pleased today to have 2 of the most relevant distinguished guests in this seminar, namely Ms. Alina Duhan, a Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, and Dr. Carlos Maria Correa, Executive Director of the South Center. I do also like to begin with thanking all those who were involved in helping us organizing this seminar, especially the permanent mission of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Geneva, which was instrumental in approaching the keynote speakers. As you know, we, the 3 countries of the organizing committee, had a very fruitful seminar in June of last year on the same issue before the pandemic of COVID-19 became a dominant subject overshadowing all international issues. At that time, we benefited from the presence of many representatives from different walks of life, including the Honorable Idris Jazairi, the latest Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. Allow me at the beginning to request 1 minute of silence in the honor and respect of Dr. Jazairi. Thank you. Since last seminar, global developments regrettably worsened the situation not only for those under the unilateral coercive measures, but also on all other countries. It's almost a year that the COVID-19 pandemic continues to severely affect all nations, in particular developing countries. Despite the fact that the response to and recovery from COVID-19 requires global solidarity and international cooperation, we continue to witness the application of unilateral coercive measures which are in contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, international law, and international human rights law, as well as multilateralism and the basic norms of international relations. Recent United Nations literature is also full of references to strongly urging states to refrain from promulgating and applying any unilateral economic, financial, or trade measures not in accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations, mindful of numerous calls for the waiver of the sanctions that undermine countries' capacities to respond to COVID-19 pandemic. We, the organizers of this virtual seminar, thought that following up to the seminar which was convened last year on 27 June 2019 at Palace Coburg, Vienna, it is imperative to follow the issue, and in this context, this virtual seminar is intended to provide a platform for the exchange of views, share experiences, and raise awareness on the illegality of unilateral coercive measures and their consequences. For organizing this seminar, we have approached around 45 countries, which some of them were also part of different initiatives in Vienna, New York, or Geneva. 38 of these countries expressed their willingness to participate at this event. Furthermore, we will have altogether 17 statements today. The joint communique has also gained support of 19 countries, which will be issued at the end of this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Now, continuing with the program, our first keynote speaker is Her Excellency Mrs. Alina Duham, Special Rapporteur on the negative impact in the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. Mrs. Duham took up her functions on March 25, 2020. She received her PhD at the Belarusian State University in 2005 and obtained her doctorate in international law and European law in 2015 in Belarus. Before this, Mrs. Duham was also part of the UN family. She worked at the UN office in Minsk, 2001 to 2005, and at the Economic Court of the Commonwealth of Independent States between 2006 and 2008. Mrs. Duham is the author of more than 120 books and articles on various aspects of international law. She has more than 40 publications, including 4 books, related to human rights, covering the inter alia issues of targeted and comprehensive sanctions, unilateral coercive measures, freedom of opinion, privacy, counterterrorism, right to development, right to education, and others. UN sanctions architecture created under the UN Security Council, applications of EU restrictive measures, cybersecurity, and current challenges and developments of labor rights in the recent ILO documents. I have now the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency, Mrs. Alina Duham. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Honorable Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be here to present some of my findings at the virtual seminar, Unilateral Coercive Measures in the Context of COVID-19 Pandemic Situation, on issues relating to the humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions in the course of the pandemic. The same problem was the focus of my attention when preparing a report for the UN General Assembly session in October 2020. Based on the information received from states and humanitarian NGOs in response to my call for inputs. Recent developments in sanctions policy of many states, as well as practice of humanitarian NGOs, clearly demonstrate that the humanitarian burden imposed by unilateral sanctions became increasingly heavy, exacerbated by the second wave of the COVID-19 situation. The COVID-19 pandemic constitutes a global challenge to the world community and the whole system of human rights, including the right to life, to personal security, to health, and to food. There is no one around the world who is not affected by the global health crisis today. Every single person in every part of the globe is endangered. In accordance with the WHO statistic, the number of reported cases has grown to above 63 million and deaths have risen to 1.4 million. It can't be doubted, therefore, that the virus is killing. The devastating effect of unilateral sanctions, as well as the need for solidarity and full respect for all human rights in the course of the pandemic, have been repeatedly proclaimed by the United Nations and other governmental and non-governmental organizations. As the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights noted in her statement of March 24, the pandemic is challenging the whole system of human rights, including such fundamental human rights as the right to life. In the UN policy brief of April 23, the Secretary General identified saving lives as the main UN priority in the time of COVID-19. Since taking my mandate in March 2020, I have aligned myself with these concerns and repeatedly called to lift or at least suspend or minimize all unilateral sanctions, including by withdrawing measures that establish trade barriers and banning tariffs, quotas, and non-tariff measures, especially those which could prevent financial transactions for the purchase of medicine, medical equipment, food, and other essential goods. I have insisted that existing humanitarian exemptions do not work and issued a guidance note seeking to minimize the negative humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions and encourage states to act together and to save lives. Unfortunately, the level of international solidarity and cooperation today is not sufficient, as the above calls didn't have much result. A number of countries didn't lift or minimize, but rather expanded the application of unilateral sanctions, using new forms, types, means, and mechanisms, affecting new types of targets. As a particular example, I need to mention that since the COVID-19 pandemic began, the United States has broadened its use and threats of sanctions, in particular by considering new types of sanctions in connection with the effort to accuse China for the spread of the disease. The Caesar Serious Civilian Protection Act of 2019, implemented this year, imposed unilateral sanctions prohibiting inter alia engaging in reconstruction and rehabilitation activities in Syria. Captains of oil tankers delivering gasoline from Iran to Venezuela, which is in bad need for electricity and fuel, have been listed for doing their job. Secondary sanctions are applied exponentially broadly and extraterritorially. Foreign entities and individuals dealing with sanctioned countries face US penalties if the United States claim jurisdiction over an element of transaction, for example, because of the use of the US dollars. Excellencies, I would like to cite here just a few practical examples of the humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions in the course of the pandemic. Because of the US comprehensive embargo on Cuba, which sent around 29,000 doctors all around the world to fight COVID-19, the country has very limited access to humanitarian aid from civil society. Cuba is also unable to buy pulmonary ventilators necessary to fight COVID-19 from the European manufacturer, as soon as the latter was acquired by the US company and suspended all commercial relations with Cuba. Venezuela, which is suffering inter alia from severe shortages of gasoline, is unable to get it because of the expanding sanctions over owners, operators, and captains of tankers, including those which are registered in Iran and Russia. Human Rights Watch report that disinfectants, including soap, are virtually non-existent in Venezuela hospitals. Moreover, shortages of water for drinking, hygienic, and sanitary purposes makes washing hands the prophylactic means recommended by the WHO impossible. Requests by Iran, Cuba, Sudan, and some other sanctioned states to the World Bank and International Monetary Fund for emergency and developmental loans to fight COVID-19 have been blocked. The Bank of England rejected to defreeze even a part of Venezuela and Syrian deposits in gold to be used for emergency measures in the course of the pandemic, even for essential goods to be purchased, for example, on Venezuela's behalf by the UNDP. Syria, Cuba, Iran, and Sudan are referring to impediments in biomedical equipment and medicine, including anesthetics, respiratory, endoscopy, and other pharmaceutical equipment, ventilators, CT scanners, tests, protective kits, and many others because of the rejection of manufacturers to make transactions with targeted states and companies, the reluctance of banks to permit bank transfers, or the enormous extension of transfer terms because of the fear of secondary sanctions. After the US listed 18 Iranian banks on October 8th, Iran is prevented from buying medicine, medical equipment, and grains from European companies. In particular, the breach of insulin supply chains endangers the lives of diabetics all around the country. In all states under sanctions, delays and increasing costs of bank transfers and deliveries have resulted in rising prices for medical equipment, food, and other essential goods. A number of Russian research centers involved in developing and testing a COVID-19 vaccine have been listed by the United States as being allegedly involved into the development of chemical and biological weapons. Services and software can't often be used even for non-commercial activity of citizens of targeted countries. Iranian doctors are reported to be unable to get access to medical databases, for example PubMed, after its server has been transferred to Google. Syria was unable to import technology necessary inter alia for CT scans and ventilators. Zooms and other online platforms can't be used for telemedicine, educational, research, communication, and other purposes. Excellencies, the pandemic has made the negative humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions more obvious and more disastrous. Targeted countries have insufficient medical personnel and face shortages of medications and medical equipment, including oxygen supplies and ventilators, protective kits, spare parts, software, fuel, electricity, drinking water, and water for sanitation that violate the right to health of their population. The violation of the right to food is occurring in the countries that depend on food imports due to the insufficient agricultural production and transportation. The deteriorating economic situation is badly affecting the exercise of economic and labor rights that in the long run results in poverty and impedes the achievement of sustainable development goals. Access to information also plays an important role in the fight against pandemics. Making this access impossible results in the violation of the right to education too. The impossibility to obtain medicine, medical care, food, electricity, and fuel results in the violation of the right to life of those who are infected by COVID-19 and those who can't get medical help and medication while suffering from other diseases or are unable to get to hospitals. The COVID-19 pandemic is affecting every person today. Unilateral sanctions imposed against 20% of the UN member states exacerbate the aforementioned calamities and thus discriminate against populations in targeted countries, which appear to be more vulnerable than in other states. Women, children, medical personnel, refugees, migrants, the elderly, the people suffering from chronic diseases are the most affected. Excellencies, I'm very much concerned that despite the repeated calls for solidarity, cooperation, and the lifting, suspension, or easing of sanctions in the course of the pandemic, sanctioning states chose to act through the mechanisms of humanitarian exceptions and humanitarian aid. However, while welcoming every assistance aimed to provide humanitarian relief to those who are affected by the crisis, I have to admit that humanitarian exceptions were and remain ineffective, confusing, complicated, and inadequate. On October 21-23, I held expert consultations in Geneva with 24 well-known humanitarian organizations, lots of which participate in the grand bargain to get some facts and evidences from their side. All participants unanimously referred to unilateral sanctions as the main obstacle to delivery of humanitarian aid. Quite often, they have to deal with several layers of sanctions that endanger the delivery of food, medicine, and other essential goods even more. Moreover, humanitarian NGOs and their workers and volunteers often became targeted by secondary sanctions, preventing them from doing their humanitarian life-saving work with an especially higher risk for smaller NGOs. Humanitarian aid mechanisms also make population dependent on humanitarian aid, hinder targeted countries' ability to respond to COVID-19 and prevent the economic recovery in the long term, while being unable to develop and maintain necessary infrastructure. It has been repeatedly reported by humanitarian NGOs that the chances to get licenses for any building or reconstruction project are elusive. The application of unilateral sanctions thus impede the ability of targeted states to implement national response plans, often results in breaches of existing regional and bilateral cooperation or integration mechanisms. Unfortunately, until now, I do not see any real assessment of the humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions being done by any of the sanctioning states, despite the obvious fact that the challenge of fighting COVID-19 is particularly severe for targeted countries. The unclear, confusing, overlapping, and complicated system of unilateral sanctions, sophisticated, lengthy, and expensive system of humanitarian exemptions, as well as the expansion of secondary sanctions, have resulted in growing overcompliance with sanctions, enormous rises in the costs of length of bank transfers, and reluctance to provide humanitarian assistance to targeted societies. I would refer here to the fact that humanitarian NGOs during the expert meeting in October insisted that the fear of sanctions already affects human rights not less than the sanctions as such. Excellencies, there is an enormous number of other points of significance I can and which shall be discussed as concern the humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions. I would use the chance to call once again on states, international organizations, as well as other actors in the position to exercise a positive influence to review and minimize the whole scope of unilateral sanctions in full compliance with obligations arising from the UN Charter, international humanitarian and human rights law, law of international responsibility, and other international obligations to guarantee that the rule of law is observed at the international arena, and to enable sanctioned states to ensure the effective protection of their population in the face of COVID-19, to repair their economies, and to guarantee the well-being of their people in the aftermath of the pandemic. A preliminary humanitarian assessment analogous to those which is currently done in the environmental area shall always be done before any unilateral action is taken. Under no circumstances shall trade in essential humanitarian goods and commodities such as medicine, antivirals, medical equipment, its component parts, and relevant software and food be subject to any form of direct or indirect unilateral economic measure or sanction. Accordingly, any impediments to such trade or to appropriate contracts, financial transactions, transfers of currency or credit documents, and transportation that hamper the ability of states to effectively fight the COVID-19 pandemic and that deprive them of vital medical care and access to clean water and food shall be lifted or at least suspended until the threat is eliminated. While unilateral sanctions stay in force still, the whole mechanism of humanitarian aid and humanitarian exceptions shall be changed. In particular, humanitarian exceptions shall be made clear, transparent, and straightforward to allow for immediate or at least very rapid implementation during emergency situations, with a corresponding regime of more lenient enforcement and to prevent overcompliance. They should be forward-looking and anticipate broad categories of international emergencies, such as pandemic, natural disasters, economic crisis, and others in order to require minimal adjustment in order to be effective. Any requests for licenses for purchase medical equipment, its component parts and software, medicine and food shall be considered without any delay and granted upon request with a presumed humanitarian purpose for the sake of saving human rights. I thank Your Excellencies for your attention and would be happy to answer if any questions will come afterwards.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alina Duhan, for your very important statement. And now we have the honor to present our second keynote speaker, Dr. Carlos Maria Correa, Executive Director of the South Center. Dr. Carlos Maria Correa began his term as South Center Executive Director on July 1st, 2018. Prior to this, he was a special advisor on trade and intellectual property of the South Center. Dr. Correa is a renowned international authority on intellectual property and technology issues. Professor Correa has worked with the Argentinian government and has been the director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies on Industrial Property and Economics, sede, at the Law Faculty of the University of Buenos Aires. Professor Correa is both a lawyer and an economist from the University of Buenos Aires and holds a PhD in law from the University of Buenos Aires. I have now the honor to give the floor to Professor Correa. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this important meeting. Excellencies, I will make a few observations and then try to address or make comments on some practical issues. 3 observations about what is uncontested. So the first thing which is clearly uncontested in relation to unilateral coercive measures is that they are illegal under international law. They violate the principles of sovereign equity, non-interference, non-discrimination, the duty to refrain from coercion. They also violate human rights, the right to health, the right to food. And this has been declared in so many places, including by the non-aligned movement, that there is no need to insist on this. But this is one uncontested fact. These measures are illegal under international law. The second uncontested fact, and this has been now clarified very eloquently by my predecessor, Madame Duhan, is that UCMs have devastating humanitarian consequences in countries that are targeted. Let me just quote one recent article by Professor Malar from the Graduate Institute of Geneva, where he and his colleagues says the debate around the humanitarian consequences of economic sanctions is by now an old debate, because there is so much evidence which has accumulated regarding the devastating consequences of UCMs that there is nothing else to be debated but just to address them and to have the means in order to prevent these measures to continue being applied. So there is no doubt there is a need to continue documenting. And I think the special rapporteur on UCM is making fantastic work documenting the consequences of these measures. And also there is very important to bring to the public this information. Just to remind you about one example, which is prior to COVID-19, as was mentioned by Madame Duhan, COVID-19 has only exacerbated these devastating consequences. But just to mention one example, in the case of Iran, it was found that because of the application of the unilateral coercive measures, 3,500 children were deprived of access to oncologic drugs, and this prevented them to get the treatment that they needed to fight cancer. So there are so many examples like this, but the public, unfortunately, is not aware of the consequences of these measures. The third uncontested fact, Excellencies, is that these measures are just a manifestation of the exercise of naked power. Interestingly, one study has found that the gross national product of targeting countries is around 10 to 50 times greater than the gross national product of the targeted countries. So this just shows that these measures are the result of the exercise of economic, political, military power. This is not the exercise of any law, and in particular, not any law which is consistent with international law. Let me mention, Excellencies, some myths about these measures. The first myth that I would like to refer to is the myth that the so-called targeted measures, some call these smart measures, are proportionate, are reasonable, they are just affecting companies or individuals. This is not the truth. The truth is that the way in which these measures are administered means that they have a comprehensive impact. They do not impact just the persons or the entities that are targeted theoretically, but they impact the whole population of the targeted countries. For instance, when all banks of a country are targeted, or the central bank of a country is targeted, transactions are completely blocked. When the oil exports of targeted countries are blocked, then these countries cannot get the main income in order to move in the economy and to sustain the public services for the population. So it is just a myth that the so-called targeted sanctions or targeted unilateral measures affect some entities or persons. The second myth I would like to refer to is the concept that humanitarian exceptions are sufficient to address issues of access to vital goods. I think Madame Dohan has also referred to this. The reality is that these exemptions are vague, are managed in an arbitrary manner. The criteria for applications change over time without any control. Any subject in the target countries is considered to be under suspicion. Vital goods are actually not delivered. Payments cannot be made. So therefore, there is a real myth that targeted or so-called, ironically called smart unilateral measures are reasonable, are proportionate, and will just achieve a very limited end. They actually affect the population of the target countries. And the third myth I would like to refer is that some advocates of unilateral coercive measures often argue that these measures are aimed at advancing the human rights agenda. Again, this is contrary to all evidence we have. These measures do not allow the target countries to realize the human rights in their jurisdictions. They just create human suffering, which is actually comparable to that of conventional warfare. So people are deprived of vital goods, of medicines, of food, and therefore this has nothing to do with aiming at advancing human rights in the targeted countries. So now, Excellencies, let me just make reference to some practicalities I've seen in the concept note for this seminar, that one of the purposes is to discuss how solutions can be brought in order to address the very serious situation created by these measures. So repudiation of the measure is not enough. It has not changed the situation. I personally don't think that the change in the government of the United States will bring too much relief. I don't think it will be a radical departure from the current situation with the US government. So there is, in the first place, the need to create more awareness among the public around the world about the nature and effects of these measures, demystify them. I think the work done again by the special rapporteur is very important in this regard. It's very important to continue documenting the situation created by these measures. The key issue, however, is the control that these measures give to some authorities in the targeting countries in relation to commercial and financial transactions. I will focus on this. Most transactions, as we know, are nominated in US dollar. And as we know, the United States laws have extraterritorial application in the context of unilateral coercive measures. And many banks and other entities, including NGOs, as was mentioned, humanitarian NGOs, was just mentioned, are afraid of the sanctions. So extraterritoriality, the vagueness of the regulations, the discretionary character of the way in which they are applied means that banks and other entities are afraid of the sanctions. Just to mention one case, in the case of the BNP Paribas Bank, it was subject to a sanction of $8.9 billion because it was found by the US authority to be in violation of the US self-established rules on unilateral measures. So this leads to, as was mentioned, to overcompliance. This means to the rejection by the banking institutions to intervene. The risk analysis for the banks is costly, but in addition is very risky because they never know whether they will be considered or not to be in compliance or not with the rules. The criteria applied in particular by the Office of Foreign Assets Control of FAC are changing, are subjective. They are not subject to objective parameters. And therefore, any transaction in US dollar, which can enter the US jurisdiction, even for a millisecond, is considered to be under the jurisdiction of the United States authority. And then this becomes, the entity may become subject to the sanctions of the US. There have been some efforts, some initiatives in order to address this problem. As you may know, for instance, the establishment of INSTEX, it was proposed by Germany, by France, by UK, the instrument in support of trade exchanges aimed at facilitating access to vital goods to Iran. But this system has not worked, actually, as far as I know, because it's based on a system of clearing, of compensation between Iranian importers and exporters that they may be involved in equivalent transactions, and therefore this has not provided the kind of solution that is needed. One alternative was mentioned by Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University at a seminar on this issue that was held on the 2nd of June this year, would be the creation of an institution that would manage transactions in currencies other than the US dollar. And in his view, and I share this view, this should not be so difficult. Today, the United States population amounts to 2% of the global population. The US economy amounts to 14% of the world economy. So this means that 86% of the world economy is not and should not be under the control of one single government. So the US should not be given the privilege of dictating the rules for the whole world. So one alternative that should be thought of is the creation of an institution that will allow to operate on other currencies in order to avoid this absurd situation in which any transaction that goes through the clearance system of the United States, even for less than a second, is subject to the jurisdiction of the United States authorities, the OFAC. A second approach, which is of course more limited, but in particular in these times of COVID-19, it will be worth to explore, is the concept of setting up a licensing authority in order to manage the so-called humanitarian exceptions. One possibility would be, for instance, for the World Health Organization to do this in relation to health-related matters. One possibility would also be to create a single-purpose digital currency in order to have transactions made in this currency outside the scope of the control of the US. This could give certainty to humanitarian supplies. This will avoid the control that is now exerted by the US government on the basis of this extraterritorial application, and will give certainty to those entities participating. So these are two ideas that at this point it may be necessary to further develop, given the fact that the targeting countries do continue to apply them, even as it was mentioned, to broaden these measures in times of humanitarian crisis as it is COVID-19. In fact, it is just important to mention that Venezuela introduced a digital currency in 2018, the Preto, and this is an interesting precedent. Excellency, so there is too much to be done in order to address this situation. We need to make the world aware what the implications of these measures are. We need to develop innovative measures in order to address one of the most important means through which these measures become effective, in particular the control of financial and commercial transactions. It is unacceptable, Excellencies, that a small group of people, I've looked at the website, and in fact, the Office of Foreign Assets Controls of the United States had a staff of 200 people. Maybe there are more today. But in any case, it is unacceptable that a small group of people like this will decide on the life, on the access to food of 1/3 of the global population. This is just unacceptable. So the South Center is willing to cooperate, of course, with the Special Rapporteur, and willing to discuss with the governments, the affected governments, and the international community any measures that will lead to cessation of these so unjust regime, and to bring again justice and solidarity to the international community, including to today's targeted countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Correa. At this time, we will listen to some short statement by organizers of the seminar. We do ask our following speakers to please keep within the 5 minutes limit, since we do have a lot of interventions today. Our first speaker in this section is the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of Cuba. It is my honor to invite her to make her statement. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measure, Ms. Alena Duhan, and Mr. Correa, Executive Director of South Center. Their intervention were very, very interesting for us, and even the proposal was very interesting. Well, the world now faces a highly complex international scenario where multilateralism and international cooperation, which are the only instrument to promote common goals and find solutions to our collective problem, are undermined by the aggressive and unilateral behavior of some countries. Cuba rejects the imposition of unilateral coercive measures against any country, which are incompatible with international law, harms the people, and contravene the foundation of the multilateral system. Unilateral coercive measures directly threaten the sovereignty and political independence of states and frustrate their effort to develop and full enjoyment of human rights by their people. Their aim is to cause economic and political hardship in the state against which they are directed. The unilateral coercive measures not only affect the countries that are victims of those sanctions, but they affect also reflected in the international organization. Seen as the result of this measure, the victim country encountered multiple obstacles to fulfill their financial commitment with them. Therefore, indirectly, unilateral coercive measures also undermine the objective and mission of the international organization. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a colossal challenge for all countries, with multiple and devastating consequences not only for health, but also for the economy, trade, and our society in general. In this context, in which the international community is concentrating its effort to face the pandemic, some countries have also had to continue to face the serious cost of the continuation and growing application of unilateral coercive measures, which aggravate the negative impact of the effect of the COVID-19 and have even strengthened the recent months. In the case of Cuba, more than 60 years we have been victims of the most severe and prolonged system of unilateral coercive measures that have been applying against any country in the world. In the midst of the complex international situation resulting from the COVID pandemic, the United States government, instead of reducing its sanctions against our country, has decided to intensify them in a cruel way, demonstrating its lack of adherence to any principle of solidarity and cooperation and the absence of the most basic instincts of humanity. In the context of the COVID-19, the US government has imposed 32 new measures against Cuba, 32. During those last months, the blockade has prevented our country from accessing medical equipment, supply, and medical technology of US origin, or even technology of equipment from the third country. Shipping companies that carry fuel to Cuba has been sanctioned in order to stop the supply of fuel to our country. Operating licenses for US companies such as Western Union have been closed in order to stop the sending of remittance to our citizens. All those measures, which are only a few examples, are aimed at strangling the country's economy and impoverishing the living conditions of our people. The application of unilateral coercive measures is a serious violation of the United Nations Charter and goes against the implementation of the 2030 Agency and its Sustainable Development Goals. Despite the multiple calls from the United Nations Secretary General, the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, and the international community to lift those sanctions in this difficult context of COVID-19, the countries that impose those measures have decided to ignore those claims. This is not acceptable. From this seminar that takes place at the United Nations office in Vienna, we must take a strong claim to the countries that impose murder sanctions against our people. It is time for solidarity and cooperation. The continuation of humanity is asking for it. Those who do not join this call are plotting against the survival of the human race itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. I have now the honor to invite the next speaker in this section, the distinguished Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran to deliver his remarks. Ambassador, you do have the floor.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Distinguished Special Rapporteur, distinguished Executive Secretary of the South Center, dear ambassadors and colleagues. Let me reiterate at the beginning that it is a great honor for me to speak as one of the organizers of this seminar. One of the features of the contemporary history is the tendency of a few countries, specifically the United States of America, to impose unilateral coercive measures against target countries in line with their foreign policy goals. Such measures have direct impacts on the sovereign rights of the affected and other countries. The Islamic Republic of Iran is among the countries that have been under such inhumane measures. This situation, coupled with the rapid and indiscriminate spread of COVID-19 across the globe, has proven the serious consequences of such countries to certain challenges. In this context, indeed, no nation alone can address these challenges, and cooperation and solidarity are the only available tools to that end, not aggravation of inhuman coercive measures against other nations for ill-intentioned political purposes. The inhuman and unlawful unilateral coercive measures adopted by the United States are seriously impacting health and lives of Iranians and other nations through constraining abilities in maintaining and strengthening the capacities for preventing and controlling further spread of coronavirus. The Islamic Republic of Iran has done its best and will continue to do whatever in its power to prevent and control further spread of this highly contagious virus. However, the broad U.S. unilateral coercive measures resulting in severe international banking restrictions on Iran have severely limited the ability of the country to finance humanitarian imports, including medicines and medical equipment. Distinguished colleagues, while the U.S. government claims to have considered exemptions for humanitarian imports in its sanctions regime, in practice, these exemptions have failed to counterbalance the unwillingness of businesses, companies, and banks to take risk by exporting or financing exempted humanitarian goods. Such measures are negatively affecting the target countries' ability to adequately respond to the mounting health consequences of the coronavirus pandemic. Furthermore, at a time when Iran is under such inhuman sanctions of the United States, strictly preventing our access to humanitarian goods, including medicines and medical equipment, a prominent Iranian scientist named Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was assassinated, which is the continuation of a heinous track of behavior and runs counter to the international law, including the principles of the United Nations Charter and basic human rights. Martyr Fakhrizadeh, as a physicist and a university professor, had carried out various scientific initiatives in different fields. One of the latest services of Martyr Fakhrizadeh was his outstanding role in the development of the first indigenous COVID-19 test kit, which is a great contribution to our national efforts in curbing the COVID-19 pandemic. He was also supervising the development of a COVID-19 vaccine. We strongly condemn this heinous terrorist act and call upon all countries and relevant international organizations to condemn this terror in strong and clear terms. To conclude, distinguished colleagues, it is time for the international community to reject such criminal acts and to call upon the United States to immediately lift all its unlawful sanctions so as to enable target countries to better deal with the virus. We call upon all in the international community to help establish a global consensus against such inhuman acts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Now we have the honor to invite our third speaker in this section, the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, to deliver his remarks. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ms. Dalila. Thank you, Ms. Elena Duhan and Carlos Maria Correa for your statement, and all ambassadors and representatives who participate in this important virtual seminar. Unilateral coercive measures are illegal and immoral actions that violate international law that some countries exercise over others with the ultimate aim of forcing a regime change. For Venezuela, the UCNs are the opposite of cooperation. They are imposed on southern countries that are fighting for their autonomy and independence. And with those measures, the objective is to boycott economies, stifle trade, promote the destruction of productive systems, and in the medium term, the stabilization of political systems. The United States exercises UCN over 29 other member states of the United Nations, affecting almost a third of the world population. The United States tries to impose its national legislation as if it were universal norm through economic coercion and the threat of use of force, representing a clear and permanent danger to the international system of nations. In 2014, my country was declared as an unusual and extraordinary threat to the security of the United States. From that moment on, the pressure has increased in quantity and intensity. Recently, North American spokespersons say that they had already applied 50% of what they had planned to apply on us, meaning we are only halfway there, and we can expect that the suffering we have endured will at least double if they keep their word. Between 2014 and today, Venezuela's resources has been reduced by more than 28%, affecting our social program and creating an unprecedented economic and social crisis. It is estimated that the loot this form the death on corruption against my country today amount to $130 billion. To respond to the negative consequence of the UCNs, the first thing we did in Venezuela was to turn our attention to our people, especially the most vulnerable, overcoming barriers and finding new ways of trading in order to continue guaranteeing at least the people's basic needs. We struggle sometimes even with our own neighbors whose governments align themselves with imperialism for fear of retaliation. Faced with this unusual situation, the National Constitutional Assembly of Venezuela has approved a constitutional law that will be enforced while the UCN exists. Its objective is to effectively counteract, mitigate, and reduce the impact of the UCN on human rights of the Venezuelan people and the illegal sanctions that these states take against companies that handle legitimate business activities with the Venezuela government. In the short time this instrument has been stated, it has begun to have an effect on our economy. The same year, on February 13, my country, as a state party to the Rome Statute, presented to the ICC a request for an investigation for crime against humanity against the United States. We accused them of being responsible for economic terrorism, and we asked that prosecution and responsibilities are determined. Venezuela is doing its part. We are responding in attention to our people, denunciation in all forums, formal complaints before international bodies, but a collective response is required. In order that UCN exists and that they cause harm is an affront to human rights. We consider that a country that does not condemn the damage caused by the UCN, that facilitates issues or lends its territory so that the rights in the other countries are violated with secondary sanctions, is an accomplice of the violation. Some member countries of the Security Council has presented a proposal so that from that instance, the form of illegal coercion and harm is condemned and eliminated in a definitive way. But to this end, Venezuela has presented three proposals. First, the creation of an international association against unilateral coercive measures, which will provide an operational platform to mitigate their impact. Second, to redouble effort to achieve the approval in the General Assembly of resolution on UCMs and the rule of law to promote the lifting of illegal measures. Third, that the Security Council regularly examine the impact of the UCN and the threat they pose to peace and the international security. Today, the world is at a crossroads. Either we fight to preserve the multilateral system as the only way to resolve the difference between sovereign countries and work together for the good of humanity, or we allow unilateralism, with its economic and military blackmail to take hold. Allow them to become the world police and set the role model on the rest of humanity. We hope humanity imposes insult on barbarism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Now, in order to continue with the program, for the next part, we have the honor to invite the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of Cuba to moderate part one of the speaker segment. Ambassador, Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. As we explained at the very beginning, we have this seminar organized in three parts. First part is led by me as ambassador of Cuba, the second part as the representative of Iran, and the third part Venezuela. In my part, I have a distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of Belarus, Burundi, China, and Namibia, and I will give the floor to all of them in this order. Please, the ambassador and permanent representative of Belarus, you have the floor. Please, sir.
Madam Chair,
we can hear you.
Thank the distinguished organizers of this seminar, the permanent missions of Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela, for their timely and topical initiative. Your effort and leadership is much appreciated. We all know that unilateral coercive measures are a scourge of the modern world. They are a relic of the past and a violation of basic human rights, including the right to food, labor, health, education, and development. Economic and political coercion as a method of pressuring sovereign states is nothing but a blatant violation of the norms and principles of international law. Consequences of unilateral coercive measures have become even more devastating during the COVID-19 pandemic. These measures, especially in the current pandemic situation, result in social problems and raise humanitarian concerns. They restrict access to basic amenities, impede the ability of sanctioned states to fight COVID-19 pandemic and to protect their population effectively. We appreciate the calls by the UN Secretary General, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures to lift all unilateral sanctions affecting measures to combat the COVID-19 pandemic and saving people's lives. We also strongly support the principles set out in the United Nations Human Rights Council Resolution 2721 and other UNHCR resolutions that define unilateral coercive measures and legislation as contrary to the international law, including international humanitarian law, the Charter of the United Nations, as well as the norms and principles governing peaceful relations among states. Belarus welcomes the establishment in 2014 of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. We are pleased to see the Special Rapporteur participate in our discussion and take pride in the fact that, as a Belarusian, Professor Dogan makes an able contribution to the efforts of the international community on this important subject. The Special Rapporteur's first thematic report to the UN General Assembly last month provides an important overview and assessment of humanitarian impact of unilateral sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. I fully support the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and appreciate her activity on this issue. In conclusion, I have the honor to reiterate the firm commitment of Belarus to working closely with all interested parties and stakeholders to promote full and unconditional eradication of all unilateral coercive measures as a means of pressure on sovereign countries, so as to ensure the consolidation of such principles of international relations as rule of law, multilateralism, mutual respect, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, the Ambassador of Belarus and Permanent Representative. And now I give the floor to the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the People's Republic of Burundi. Sir, you have the floor.
Oh, sorry, the mic was not switched on. Distinguished colleagues, ambassadors, organizers, I would like to give you a short brief lecture about the situation following the coronavirus from March to November in Burundi. I think Burundi is a very small African country, and it's one of the lucky states where the coronavirus has not affected as much as in many other high developed countries. First of all, so I would like to thank the AFRA group, especially Dr. Director Abdul Razak, who has made possible that Burundi has received medical materials and equipments for the testing and handling coronavirus in worth of €150,000, including necessary instructions. At the beginning of March, there was no infection discovered in Burundi. As a precaution, the government closed the borders at the end of March and issued a landing ban in the airport. No restrictions was imposed within the country. Mask was not mandatory. Burundi confirmed the first positive case of COVID-19 end of March. This was 2 imported cases who has traveled previously 14 days to Dubai, United Emirates, and Kigali, Rwanda. The total numbers today, 62,200 tests was made. From them, 681 confirmed cases and 575 recoveries. In the total, 105 active confirmed cases was registered and only one total of deaths. So the total of deaths is number one. The overall positive rate of the tested persons is 1.06%. Attack rate 61.45 per 1 million inhabitants. The weekly screening rate during the week 3 tests per 10,000 inhabitants. Up to date, 215 imported cases, 458 cases from local transmission. The cure rate of 89.15%, 600 out of 673. 72 positive people, 10.7% are active with minor symptoms under treatment. The case fatality is 0.15%, 1 of 673 cases. In October, the Committee of Experts under the supervision of the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Health has established. In November 8, the airport has been reopened after 7 months of all. All hygiene and distancing measures remain in force in Burundi. Wearing a mask is optional, with the exception of the airport, where it is mandatory. The COVID-19 negative test certificate is mandatory for all travelers on arrival in Burundi and at the departure. On arrival in Burundi, the COVID-19 test is systematically and quarantine is of 72 hours is mandatory, including for those with negative test certificates. If there is a positive case in the plane, quarantine is 7 days pending, and 2 second tests of COVID-19, no future restrictions. These figures show that the small country of Burundi, with a population of 12 million, has handled, luckily until now, the COVID pandemic situation. Mass testing is continued. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the People's Republic of Burundi. Now I give the floor to the distinguished Ambassador and Permanent Representative of China. Please, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, Madam Ambassador, Excellencies and colleagues. Last June, as we may recall, we had a very, very successful seminar on unilateral coercive measures and their impacts here, at which we firmly say no to unilateralism with a very strong common voice. So the seminar today is both timely and important to further expanding the international consensus against the unilateral coercive measures. I would like to thank the permanent missions of Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela for the great efforts they've made for the preparation of the seminar. And also I would like to thank our colleagues, the previous speakers for their inputs, especially Dr. Dohan, Dr. Maria Correa, and also my colleagues in the missions. Excellencies and colleagues, unilateral coercive measure has been served as a basic tool by the US in their foreign policy since World War II, and has given rise to numerous huge humanitarian disasters in many countries. The US has chosen to turn a blind eye in a selective manner to these grave consequences, though it has to chant the slogan of protecting human rights on other occasions. In the face of the escalating global pandemic, the international community have stood for multilateralism and committed to strengthening solidarity in support of each other in overcoming the hardship and difficulties, while the United States have acted recklessly and gone even further on the road by not only further expanding the scope of unilateral coercive measures, but also reinforcing their enforcement. They have been indulged in the acts of boldly, arbitrarily blocking and oppressing of many countries on the various pretexts. They withdraw from the Iranian deal, the JCPOA. After that, they continue to exert maximum pressure policy on Iran and try to activate the snapback mechanism, the provision under the UN Security Councils. And while they exert pressure and the sanctions, impose sanctions on Venezuela, they've also imposed numerous sanctions on Cuba, as we've just heard the statements from the distinguished ambassador from Cuba. And they've also engaged in long-arm jurisdictions to oppose normal economic activities of other countries. This is of extraterritorial in nature and totally unacceptable. They prevent the normal economic and the trade exchanges between and among countries, and even, I think, in the case of the US European allies, they may see that the US obstruction of construction of the normal Nord Stream natural gas pipeline between Russia and European countries. And the US have also spared no efforts to undermine international cooperation and coordinated the global efforts in the fight against the COVID. As noticeably, we've seen that they targeted on WHO. They suspended its funding to WHO and even pulled out from this organization, an organization most representative and authoritative international organization in the field of global health. And they shirk international responsibilities and obligations and virtually become the world #1 defaulter, as we all seen that the US has withheld the assessed contributions to the UN for a long time. And as of the end of September this year, the US had arrears of almost, in fact, over $1 billion, accounting for 73 of the total unpaid assessed contributions of the UN, thus plunging the organization into huge financial difficulty. So I think not only they have done this, but also the impacts of such moves, such measures by the US are enormous, and they especially during the pandemic, such compacts and implications have become even more worse and more harmful. They further aggregate the economic and the financial situation in many countries, weaken the ability of their governments and the people to obtain the necessary resources to fight the pandemic. And such moves are totally in violation of the basic human rights. And such moves virtually intensify the regional conflicts, bringing threats to regional peace and security, especially, I think, in the Middle East, Gulf, and Venezuela. Such UCMs by the US will encourage anti-globalization to the detriment of global economic governance, delay the recovery of the world economy, and become a major political obstacle to global economic development. So I think, in short, that the US UCMs not only are unpopular, but they violate the basic norms governing the international relations and go against the inevitable trend of the human development and the progress. China commands the tenacity and the fighting spirit of Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela in defense of the power of the US, and would like to pay tribute to their efforts in resisting the external pressure while coordinating their work, both the epidemic prevention and the economic development. Excellencies and colleagues, President Xi Jinping has recently expanded China's important positions and initiatives on upholding multilateralism at the BRICS, APEC, and the G20, as well as the UN meetings commemorate the 70th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. While expressing explicit opposition to unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction, President Xi called for efforts to go beyond ideology by respecting each other's choices of social system, economic model, and the development path in line with their respective national conditions. We do think that unilateralism has no way out, and in the current world, there is only one system. That is the international system with the United Nations at its core. There is only one set of rules, that is the basic norms of international relations set out in the UN Charter. Multilateralism is not an option, but a necessity. International relations can only be coordinated by rules, but not be subjected to manipulation of anyone who has the biggest fist. Major countries should behave like major countries. It is an important principle that international affairs should go through extensive consultation by all countries, and the development rights of countries be respected. So in the face of the pandemic, the international community should cooperate in good faith and help each other. And we do think it's important for us to push ahead our process by focusing on unity instead of differences, on reason vis-a-vis prejudice, so as to create greatest synergy of all countries against the pandemic. In short, we hope, in conclusion, we hope that through today's seminar, we could further expand the global consensus and cement the global consensus on opposition to unilateral coercive measures, and recommitting ourselves on multilateralism and intensify the international cooperation with innovative thinkings, and we should work together not only in opposing unilateral coercive measures, but work to enhance together to uphold justice and maintain security, global security, share development results, and jointly control the destiny of the world. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, the Ambassador, distinguished permanent representative of China. Now I give the floor to my last speaker in the group, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Namibia. Sir, you have the floor, please. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. No problem at all. I also greet the ambassadors and permanent representatives of Iran and Venezuela. And I would like to congratulate the organizers of this event this afternoon for drawing attention to the important topic of unilateral coercive measures. I would also like to thank the keynote speakers who have brought us additional information and important information to note on the very negative effects of these measures on the affected countries. It is important that we bring more attention to this. Namibia, in principle, does not support unilateral coercive measures against sovereign states. As the world combats the COVID-19 pandemic, some states face more obstacles than others. The damaging impact of unilateral sanctions, especially during this challenging time, can definitely not be denied. Namibia, as a proponent for equality and unity and the human rights of all, and especially as we are faced with a multitude of challenges that threaten our future, is looking forward to the equal treatment of all states. It is important that we embrace all in the spirit of multilateralism, in the interest of defeating COVID-19, in the interest of achieving the SDGs, in the interest of safeguarding global peace and the human rights of every individual. We ask sanctioning states to lift sanctions that are imposed on individual sovereign states. In conclusion, Madam Chair, I would like to confirm that Namibia supports the joint communiqué as an outcome of today's event. And I thank you very much for the invitation and for the possibility to participate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's a pleasure. Now I have to give the floor to the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Iran, but first I would like to thank the Ambassador of Iran in Geneva that helped us to organize this meeting together with the Permanent Representative here in Vienna. Thank you. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's a great pleasure for me to moderate this part of the seminar, which includes the statements by distinguished ambassadors and permanent representatives of Nicaragua, Niger, Pakistan, Palestine, and the Russian Federation. I would like to invite the distinguished Minister, Private Secretariat of Citizen Power of National Policies Presidency of Nicaragua, as the first speaker of this part to deliver his remarks. You have the
Thank
floor.
you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. President. The United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada have been imposing unilateral, coercive, illegal measures on other countries, including Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran. The imposition of unilateral, coercive, and illegal measures on persons and institutions are completely illegal. The only legal sanctions are those of the United Nations Security Council. They reflect the mentality of those who feel morally superior by appointing themselves as global watchdogs, exercising the function of police, prosecutor, judge, and jailer with extraterritoriality outside the framework of the law. This is the survival in the 21st century of the colonialist and neo-colonialist mentalities of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. There are no charges, no presumption of innocence, no right to defense, no right to an attorney who could not be paid anyway by designated persons or institutions, no right to due process, no right to a trial. There is no right to legal property or to perform economic transactions, just administrative orders without judicial recourse. Claiming to defend human rights, the coercive measures violate all of the civil and human rights of developing countries. Not being able to have financial or economic transaction produces a permanent civil death, a caste of economic untouchables, which is a cruel and unusual punishment, which is unconstitutional in the United States. As an aggravating factor, the United States claims extraterritoriality in its laws and administrative measures but rejects the application of international law in its country. It also applies coercive measures to third parties who are criminalized for not complying with their illegal unilateral coercive measures. The most frequent measures consist of the establishment of economic, commercial, and financial restrictions, such as embargoes, or individual coercive measures prohibiting third parties from carrying out transactions with the victims, made possible by the banking dictatorship that the United States exercises over the SWIFT transfer system. Economic coercive measures have been used as instruments to isolate a country from world trade and finance, to blackmail political behavior, to influence trade policy, or for larger purposes, such as destabilizing governments or carrying out coups d'etat. There have been the following coups or attempted coups in Latin America and the Caribbean in this century: Venezuela, 2002, Haiti, 2004, Honduras, 2009, Ecuador, 2010, Paraguay, 2012, Brazil, 2016, Nicaragua, 2018, Bolivia, 2019. All of these coups d'etats or attempted coups d'etats were against leftist or progressive governments, all without exception, and constitute a mega intervention in Latin America regional politics. These strategies are part of regime change schemes which promote violence, war, humanitarian crises, and instability that have left several once prosperous countries in the Middle East in the most complete ruin. The refusal to lift the illegal measures during a murderous pandemic such as COVID-19 elevates their illegality to the level of a crime against humanity, according to Article 7, Paragraph 1 of the Rome Statute, which I read: less humanity, K, other inhumane acts of a similar character, intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health. If the international community is sincerely committed to human rights, multilateralism, the rule of law, and the equality of all states, it must demand an immediate end to illegal unilateral coercive measures that threaten the health of entire nations, constitute crimes against humanity, and threaten the achievement of all of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. It is an honor having Your Excellency with us today. I would like now to invite the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of Niger to deliver his remarks. You have the floor.
Lo vamos, y tienen limpio, le vamos a pasar a Sabra y mandarlo a la compañera. No, le pasamos a...
I request the distinguished participants and excellencies to mute their microphone. Now, once again, I invite the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of Niger. So I move to the next speaker, if we will have Niger with us, so we can give the floor afterwards. I would like to invite now the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of Pakistan to deliver his remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I will join other speakers in expressing our appreciation for the initiative taken by 3 countries, Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela, and organize this important seminar. We fully support the initiative, and given the importance of this discussion, and this has become all the more important keeping in view the current situation where the world is passing through an extraordinary time While the COVID-19 pandemic continues to severely affect all nations, the developing countries remain the most vulnerable. The response to and recovery from COVID-19 requires global solidarity and international cooperation. Deplorably and unfortunately, however, we continue to witness the application of unilateral coercive measures which are contrary to the purposes and principles of UN Charter and international law, multilateralism, and the basic norms of international relations, as well as humanity. The negative impact of UCMs has been repeatedly affirmed in numerous resolutions of the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. And today we also witnessed from the statements of the experts that the impact is very damaging. Both the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council recognize that people should not be deprived of their own means of subsistence, especially as concerns food and medicine, and that the extraterritorial application of law, such as UCMs, affecting international humanitarian and human rights law is inadmissible. This is particularly relevant in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, when the consequences of UCMs become even more grave. It is against this backdrop that as a member of G77 and non-aligned movement, Pakistan joins the call for the immediate withdrawal of all unilateral sanctions, which undermine the ability of targeted states to respond effectively to the pandemic crisis and to save lives. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I would like now to invite the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of the State of Palestine to deliver his remarks. You have the floor, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Allow me at the outset to extend our heartfelt condolences to the government and people of Iran for the death of Professor Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who fell victim to a cowardly terrorist attack. May his soul rest in peace. Allow me also to extend our appreciation for the organizers of this seminar, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Republic of Cuba, and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. This seminar comes at a time when humanity is faced with a huge challenge. And unfortunately, those who are paying the price for the impact of unilateral coercive measures are the most vulnerable in any given society. And these are millions of children, women, unemployed, and the most vulnerable of any society. I represent a country, Excellencies, dear friends, State of Palestine, a country that has been suffering from the longest occupation of modern history. An occupation which not only aims at stealing the land, but also at making the lives of Palestinians miserable, and by this employing measures that are contrary to international law and international humanitarian law. These measures not only are limited to military measures of land confiscation and demolishing of homes, arresting of people, including minors, but also goes to withholding tax money that belongs to Palestinians and that are necessary and vital for combating the pandemic COVID-19. And these measures include the imposing of a total blockade of the Gaza Strip, which is home to over 2 million people, a blockade that has been going on for more than a decade, turning the Gaza Strip into the biggest open-air prison on earth. Unfortunately, in recent years, the United States administration, the Trump administration, has joined Israel, the occupying power, in imposing sanctions against the Palestinian people. The United States government has stopped funding of the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees, an agency that is entrusted with providing healthcare services, educational services to hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees inside Palestine and outside Palestine. The United States government stopped completely, has frozen all of their funding to this agency. Once again, Palestine stands firm and understands very well and feels very well the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures. And that's why we reiterate our not only sympathy and solidarity with all countries that are subjected to this policy, but also we would like to affirm our commitment to multilateralism, our commitment and respect for international law and international humanitarian law. In conclusion, I am honored and happy to announce that the State of Palestine will also be supporting the joint communique at the end of this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I would like now to invite the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of the Russian Federation to deliver his remarks. Mr. Ambassador, you have the floor, please.
Dear colleagues and friends, like previous speakers, I would like to begin with thanking the organizers of this event, the Republic of Cuba, Islamic Republic of Iran, and Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. This is the second time we gather to address issues of unilateral coercive measures and their impact on the international agenda. Sustainability and continuity of such dialogue is very important. I wish I could say that since our last meeting in June 2019, the environment for our discussions has become more favorable. Unfortunately, this is not the case in point. COVID-19 outbreak has put the international community and its ability to act jointly to the biggest test in decades. Since the beginning of 2020, the pandemic has affected every country in the world. Infection toll has already surpassed 59 million cases worldwide, with more than 1.4 million lives lost. The numbers are still going up every day. In order to address the spread of COVID-19, countries are forced to impose domestic restrictive measures while increasing spendings on healthcare and on economic support. These factors put immense burden on economies, especially of those countries that have already been under pressure of unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States. Russia has been experiencing it for a long time. As of November 11, 2012, the United States has identified 320 Russian and Russia-related entities and individuals in the so-called specially designated nationals list. For many delegations participating here today, this remains a crucial issue as well. Illegal restrictions continue to be introduced in contravention of the international law and the UN Charter. They increasingly acquire extraterritorial character with serious humanitarian consequences for ordinary people. This is especially detrimental for countries facing difficult social and economic situation or going through armed conflicts. Humanitarian exceptions as practice don't work since economic operators try to avoid risks in the environment of blackmailing and coercion. Unilateral restrictions are simply a way to punish countries that choose to act independently. That is why, from the very outset of the COVID-19 crisis, Russia has been urging to ease, at least temporarily, unilateral sanctions regime for countries affected the most. These calls come from not only from us. We are supported by the majority of the international community. The UN Secretary General urged to waive unilateral sanctions that affect countries' capacity to respond to the pandemic. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights reported that unilateral sanctions have an especially negative impact on human rights implementation during COVID-19 outbreak. In March 2020, Russian President Vladimir Putin proposed creation of green corridors, sanctions-free trade channels, in order to give countries unrestricted access to essential goods, personal protection, food, and medical supplies. President Putin reiterated this proposal in his address to the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. In current circumstances, this is not a matter of politics, but rather a moral obligation, an obligation that the United States failed to uphold. However, as time passed by, states managed not only to adapt to fighting the pandemic despite the burden of coercive measures, but also to support others. Russia has been providing humanitarian aid for COVID-19 relief to over 46 countries. Apart from bilateral aid, we allocated extra funds to relevant organizations of the UN family, including the International Atomic Energy Agency. During the recent Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Meeting and G20 Summit, the Russian President put a particular emphasis on the recovery of the international trade from impact of the pandemic. Abandoning the malign practice of unilateral sanctions is one of the keys to that goal. Trans-border nature of COVID-19 crisis revealed an increasing interdependence of states, but at the same time a growing rift between many of them. In this regard, there is a need for international institutions, and first of all the United Nations, to play the central coordinating role in unifying the efforts to put an end to the pandemic. Russia has been consistently advocating for the efficiency of such approach, while unilateral sanctions only undermine it, breaking trust in international institutions. In the meantime, we will continue to work with like-minded countries within different fora where significant progress in addressing the pandemic has already been made, such as BRICS or Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Events like today's seminar also provide a platform for constructive exchange on where we stand in fighting COVID-19, both individually and collectively. It is my sincere hope that all these efforts will result in us seeing each other in person next time we have similar meeting. And in conclusion, let me congratulate the organizers of this seminar and all of us on elaboration of a strong communique, joint communique to be adopted today. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now pass the floor to Ms. Dalila for taking us to the next section of the seminar.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for moderating part 2 of the list of speakers. Now we have the honor to invite the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to moderate the second part of the third part of the speakers list in the second segment. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Dalila. It is a great pleasure for me to moderate this part of the seminar, which includes the statement by the distinguished ambassadors and permanent representatives of South Africa and Vietnam, and distinguished representatives of Syria and Turkey. Now, I would like to invite the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of South Africa as the first speaker of this part to deliver this remark. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Distinguished ambassadors, esteemed participants and friends. At the outset, let me commend the delegations of the friendly nations of Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela for arranging and convening this important and timely seminar. We also wish to acknowledge the participation of Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. We equally welcome the participation of the South Center, a progressive institution that has over the years served the interest of the developing world and continue to forge South-South cooperation and solidarity. Program Director, listening carefully to the speakers that have spoken so far this afternoon, I'm convinced that we need to remain united and resolute in tackling those issues that threaten international solidarity and undermine the existence of a rules-based, equitable international system and the creation of a better world for all of us on this globe. The world is currently seized with and challenged by a major pandemic, COVID-19, that knows no borders, does not discriminate, and is proving difficult to eradicate, even with the good news of impending vaccines. This pandemic is further exposing the socio-economic inequalities within and between countries and regions, and has major implications for the world economy. Of particular concern is the question of how the Global South will eventually emerge from this health crisis. South Africa, like many other countries, was not spared the negative impact of the COVID-19 outbreak. We are still dealing with emergence of new cases and the possibility of the second wave. As current chair of the African Union, South Africa has been able to work closely with fellow African countries in ensuring a coordinated response to COVID-19 and in attempts aimed at mobilizing resources to acquire personal protective equipment and testing equipment. Africa has worked in collaboration with the World Health Organization in terms of public awareness raising and similar campaigns. We continue to call for the globe to not see profits from this human disaster. As we face this enormous global health emergency, some countries have unjustifiably continued to impose unilateral coercive measures, oblivious of the reality we are facing to addressing COVID-19. They have unilaterally implemented sanctions, embargoes, blockades, and continue to make threats against sovereign member states of the international community. These acts of unilateral coercive measures are undermining political governance and are a threat to regional and international peace and security. The extraterritorial nature of these actions contradict international law and the basic principles of humanity. The punitive coercive measures which these countries are imposing are negatively impacting global trade and the free movement of people, goods, and services. As we face COVID-19, we need to strengthen global supply chains by securing access to vital, much-needed goods. This especially applies to much-needed medical supplies and equipment and access to financial instruments and banking services to process this. Yet some countries continue to impose sanctions and restrictions on countries needing these resources the most. In such cases, the common people are being denied access to medical services. Hospitals are experiencing a shortage of supplies. Therefore, the application of unilateral coercive measures undermines national efforts of countries to effectively fight the COVID-19 pandemic. These cruel and inhumane actions cannot be justified nor condoned. In this regard, these actions are an affront to human rights. Under Article 41 of the UN Charter, the UN Security Council is the only entity that has the right to impose coercive measures necessary to ensure compliance with international law. It is important to recollect that the Security Council adopted Resolution 2532 in July this year, which support the Secretary General appeal for a global ceasefire to tackle COVID-19 pandemic. We, however, regret that this resolution did not take into consideration the necessary actions to alleviate the impact of unilateral coercive measures on nations' efforts to deal with COVID-19 pandemic and the humanitarian situation in affected countries. In my sub-region, the Southern African Development Community declared 25th of October as the day for SADC to campaign as a region for the unconditional removal of sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. We also wish to reiterate the AU's African Union position that economic sanctions imposed against Zimbabwe and the Sudan should be lifted to allow our sister governments to respond adequately to this pandemic. Similarly, Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, and Syria should not be subjected to unilateral coercive measures, as these hamper their efforts to implement measures to deal with COVID-19. As I conclude, I wish to reiterate the importance of unity and solidarity as we continue to deal with the negative effect of this global pandemic. South Africa hopes that the rollout and distribution of vaccines should reach all our countries on time and should be affordable. In this way, no one will be left behind. we support the communique as the outcome of this seminar. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I would like to invite the distinguished representative of Syria to deliver his remark. Madame Al-Saleh, you have the floor. We will go to the next country and come back to Syria afterwards. Now, I would like to invite the distinguished representative of Turkey to deliver his remark. Ms. Soylu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for inviting us to this virtual seminar. We would like to extend our condolences to Iran and the family of Mohsin Fakhrizadeh. I'm sure you have seen the statements issued by our ministry. Mr. Chairman, COVID-19 pandemic showed the indispensable nature of international solidarity in responding to such an important problem. We have actively contributed to efforts to counter COVID-19. We are glad to inform that Turkey has so far responded to 247 bilateral calls for assistance from 156 different countries. Large majority of them were in-kind donations, some others were in the form of financial aid. On the other hand, we have clearly expressed our position with respect to the unilateral coercive measures on several occasions. We would like to reiterate that the Republic of Turkey takes the sanctions decided and implemented by the UN as the sole basis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Soylu. Now I would like to invite the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of Vietnam to deliver his remark. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, colleagues. I would like to appreciate the ambassadors of Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela for organizing this very important seminar. And I strongly believe that this meeting will achieve fruitful results and contribute its voice to the implementation of international obligations for confronting with the COVID-19 pandemic. Colleagues, we are living in the uncertain period caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The disease has been creating a huge crisis in many states and territories. For that reason, the international community should closely cooperate and invest all efforts to seek and exercise all necessary measures to address global challenges, including the pandemic, toward a sustainable development. And we are in the view that all states shall respect and fully implement international rules. Actions which run counter to the UN Charter and the Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly regulations and cooperation among states need to be refrained. The United Nations General Assembly, in particular, adopted a resolution entitled Comprehensive and Coordinated Response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which strongly urges states to refrain from promulgating and applying any unilateral economic, financial, or trade measures not in accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Mindful of numerous calls for the waiver of the sanction that undermine countries' capacities to respond to COVID-19 pandemic by a large number of the UN member states and both the UN Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights. These actions have eroded mutual trust, intensified tensions, and posed latent risks of conflict. In this regard, Vietnam calls for the removal of unilateral coercive measures which may cause humanitarian burden on people and prevent civilians to enjoy medical treatment during this challenging period of the pandemic. Vietnam emphasized the necessity to enhance multilateralism and cooperation between states and other stakeholders under the auspices of the UN Charter and international law in order to resolve conflicts peacefully, respect each other's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. This should be a critical condition to create a stable environment for the international community to fulfill sustainable development goals. And thank you for your kind attention. And I hope this seminar will be a successful one. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I would like to invite the distinguished representative of Syria to deliver his remark. Madame Al-Saleh, you have the floor. We will yes. Madam Saleh.
Yeah, hello. Do you hear me, Mr. Chair?
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Apologies, Mr. Ambassador, for this technical problem. Thank you for giving me the floor. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of my ambassador. At the outset, I would like to thank the permanent missions of Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela for organizing this important seminar. Since the beginning of the pandemic, all preventive measures have been undertaken in Syria to respond adequately to its impact on Syrian citizens, including through cooperation with several international organizations. However, humanitarian challenges caused by unilateral coercive measures were devastating and negatively impacted the government's ability to respond to the pandemic and the implementation of national response plans. Despite the tragic situation resulting from the pandemic, which is experienced worldwide with severe effects on the entire population at many levels, we continue to suffer from the use of UCMs in flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter, international law, and international human rights law, as well as in absolute contradiction to the established principles of multilateralism and the basic norms of international relations and diplomacy. These unilateral measures have, in particular, hindered the right of civilians to health. They have blocked access to medicine and medical technologies, equipment, and supplies, which are extremely needed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, the transfer of all types of support to fight the pandemic in my country has been obstructed because of these measures. Syria has suffered since the 80s of last century from different types of sanctions imposed by the United States of America. Additionally, the US, the European Union, and other countries have imposed serious illegal unilateral coercive measures on Syria since 2011, including asset freezing, travel ban, oil embargo, and export restrictions on equipments and technologies. These coercive measures have been targeting the stability of my country's economy, causing significant losses, not to mention their negative impact on the human rights and the livelihood of Syrian people, forced hundreds of thousands to leave the country. The growing effects of these measures are causing serious suffering in obtaining essential humanitarian items, as documented in reports and statements made by the UN. They further impede efforts by the Syrian government to comply fully with its commitments towards international agreements, including the SDGs 2030. Furthermore, the restrictive measures against the Central Bank of Syria are the most serious. This is because it is the principal bank that is authorized to support financial operations aimed at securing the basic needs of Syrian citizens. By targeting cash transfer transactions, all sectors supporting the humanitarian needs for Syrians are severely affected, including supply of food, medicine, medical equipment, and energy products by the state, as well as by the international organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, the US and the EU have alleged making exceptions on their imposed unilateral restrictive measures to exclude financing basic pharmaceutical and foodstuffs. However, these claimed exceptions are not being implemented in reality, where the Syrian Central Bank has not received any response from banks when sending payment orders or any request that would release funds for a period of time abroad in order to fund these humanitarian materials which are related to the basic needs of the Syrian people. In an attempt to enhance the overall prosperity and stability of my country, the Syrian government has adopted a strategy of strengthening South-South cooperation in order to find development alternatives and to renew trade and economic alliances with international partners, including with the Russian Federation, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the People's Republic of China, and other friendly countries. In conclusion, I will conclude by highlighting the necessity of ensuring the flow of food and medicine to all countries, the continuity and availability of basic needs through enhancing international cooperation in full respect to the UN Charter, and the immediate elimination of the UCMs in order to ensure the full, effective, and efficient response of all members of the international community to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ms. Al-Saleh. Now I pass the floor to Ms. Dalila for taking us to the next section of the seminar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for moderating the last part of the list of speakers. We apologize for the length of the seminar so far. We have received very invaluable interventions, and we would like to hear them all. So before after we have finished the already registered list of speakers, and before moving to the final part of the seminar, I would like to open the floor for any distinguished representative who wish to make interventions or pose questions for our distinguished keynote speakers. At the moment, I think we already have 2 extra speakers. We kindly request to be brief so we can hear all of them. To begin with, we have Mr. Pearson Chikigi from Zimbabwe, and please, sir, you have the floor.
Excellencies, good evening. I hope I can be heard from Geneva.
We can hear you. Please go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you. It's an honor to join you from Geneva. I want to register my special thanks to their excellencies, the ambassadors of Cuba, Iran and Venezuela in Vienna for organizing this seminar on unilateral coercive measures. Zimbabwe's participation in this seminar is only natural given our well-known and long struggle with illegal sanctions imposed on my country. We have labored under the weight of unilateral coercive measures for 2 decades now. First, the United States of America imposed illegal and unjustified sanctions against my country under the so-called Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, ZIDERA of 2001, which was amended with a view to further tightening its provisions in 2018. Supplementing these sanctions are executive orders, which have been renewed on a yearly basis, including during this period of the pandemic. The sanctions are all-encompassing and comprehensive, and contrary to claims that they are ring-fenced and targeted against a few individuals. Livelihoods have been destroyed, the economy has been devastated, and ordinary men and women are hurting. The European Union also introduced its own sanctions in February 2002, while the EU lifted some of the sanctions in 2014, those against the Zimbabwe Defense Industries Company, senior government officials, and against service chiefs, as well as an arms embargo, are still in place. As a result of these sanctions, Excellency and colleagues, Zimbabwe has lost billions in revenue over the past 20 years. This includes lost bilateral donor support, estimated at 4.5 billion annually since 2001, US dollars 12 billion in loans from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank. Commercial loans of US 18 billion and a GDP reduction of estimated 21 billion. These conservative estimates of our potential development losses may look insignificant for the relatively more developed countries, but for a low-income developing country like Zimbabwe, these are substantial amounts based on our level of development. Excellencies, it is a demonstration of the resilience of our people that Zimbabwe has been frozen out of international capital markets for 2 decades. I wish to recognize the presence of the Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, who is here with us, and we welcome her comprehensive statement earlier in the meeting. The government of Zimbabwe has already invited the Special Rapporteur to visit the country, and we look forward to her visit. Faced with the scenario that I have portrayed, under conditions of unilateral coercive measures, confronting the COVID-19 pandemic has been more like being thrown into a boxing ring to face a deadly opponent with your hands tied behind your back. Zimbabwe's COVID-19 strategic preparedness and response plan has been made less effective by these unilateral coercive measures. With our capacity to import equipment, COVID-19 test kits, medicines, and other materials essential in the fight against COVID pandemic being seriously undermined and weakened. I wish to conclude my brief remarks by acknowledging the support and solidarity of the United Nations, the non-aligned movement, the African Union, and the Southern African Development Community, SADC. Outside these multilateral configurations, we have continued also to receive support and solidarity from countries such as the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, Belarus, Turkey, among many other countries. Most recently, as alluded to by the Ambassador of South Africa, on 25 October, we commemorated the second anniversary of the SADC-wide Anti-Sanctions Day, an initiative by the heads of state and government of the SADC region. We are grateful to our friends and neighbors in our region and beyond. In this respect, I wish to thank His Excellency Ambassador Molekane of South Africa for his statement earlier on, a statement of solidarity with my country. In calling for the unconditional removal of all unilateral coercive measures on ourselves and on all countries and people affected by these unilateral coercive measures, we lend our full support to the joint communique. I thank you.
Thank you very much, the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe. Now, the last in our list is the permanent representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran to the UN in Geneva. Ambassador, you have the floor. Ambassador, please, if you can turn your microphone on. You still are muted. We will try to unmute you from here. Yeah, it seems like you need to unmute yourself. We can still hear you, unfortunately. If you can just try again. Can you please try to talk and see if we can hear you? Unfortunately, we cannot still. We will go to the next part and come back to you. I want to thank all of the speakers today for their very invaluable remarks. For the last part, or to finalize this program, we have now the honor to invite the distinguished ambassador and permanent representative of Cuba to present to the joint communique. And Ambassador, Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. This is the joint communique that we prepare as a result of this meeting. This communique is signed by Belarus, Bolivia, Burundi, Cuba, Eritrea, Iran, Laos, China, Myanmar, Namibia, Nicaragua, North Korea, Pakistan, Palestine, Russia, South Africa, Syria, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. The communique is about unilateral coercive measures and their impact in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. Viena, 30 November 2020. And the communique said, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to severely affect all nations, in particular developing countries. Despite the fact that the response to and recovery from COVID-19 require global solidarity and international cooperation, we continue to witness the use of unilateral coercive measures, especially of secondary and extraterritorial implications, which are in flagrant breach of the basic purpose and principle of the United Nations Charter, international law, and international human rights, as well as in absolute contradiction with the established principle of multilateralism and the basic norm of international relations and diplomacy. The COVID-19 pandemic is affecting every person today and has made the negative humanitarian effect of unilateral coercive measures more obvious. Those measures have undeniable impact on human rights, in particular economic, social, cultural rights, as they hamper the full realization of social and economic development and hinder the well-being of the population in the target country, in particular women, children, adolescents, the elderly, and persons with disability. Unilateral coercive measure endangers, inter alia, the right to life, right to education, right to food, right to a decent job, access to information, and a basic standard of life. They especially hinder the right to health, as they obstruct access to medicine and medical technology, equipment, and supply. This is particularly relevant in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, where those measures have even hampered the transfer of donations to fight COVID-19. Unilateral coercive measures also undermine the collective right of people, including the right to self-determination, right to develop, and environment right. At this time of global uncertainty, with the involved catastrophic impact of the novel coronavirus pandemic COVID-19, we express our solidarity with all countries as we battle its effect. We are saddened by the loss of lives and extend our heartfelt condolence to the family of those who have lost loved ones. We also wish those who have been affected and are facing with seemingly insurmountable challenges a speedy and full recovery. We salute the dedicated and hardworking healthcare professionals, medical research, racing to develop vaccine and treatment, and other frontline workers around the world who are bearing the brunt of the response to the current health crisis. We are especially concerned by the immediate and long-term impact of the disease on developing countries and commend those donor partners and institutions that have initiated a special measure to assist developing countries in their effort to combat the pandemic. We also commend the solidarity and cooperation among developing countries within the framework of South-South cooperation in contribution to the effort to confront the pandemic. We appreciate the World Health Organization for its leading role in coordinating pandemic preparedness and response, and encourage it to also take the lead in developing a strategy to ensure the government have adequate supplies of essential medical equipment to contain the spread of COVID-19 and to mitigate its impact. We also appreciate the work carried out by other international organizations in the fight against COVID-19, in particular, the support provided by the countries subject to unilateral coercive measures. In this regard, we welcome the Secretary General appeal of 12 March 2020 on the waiving of sanctions that undermine countries' capacity to respond to the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic, as well as the statement made by the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights on 30 March on the need to ease or suspend sectoral sanctions in light of their debilitating impact on the health sector and human rights, and the necessity to avoid the collapse of any country's medical system. We take note of the work on this issue of the Special Rapporteur of the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights and welcome her report to the United Nations General Assembly on 16 October 2020 about the impact of the unilateral sanctions on targeted countries' ability to respond to the COVID-19 and implementation of national response plan, in which she urged states, international organizations, and other relevant actors to review and minimize the whole scope of unilateral sanctions to ensure that the humanitarian sections are effective, efficient, and fully adequate with the view to enable sanctioned states to protect their population in the face of COVID-19. We also reaffirm the declaration made by the G77 and China calling to adopt urgent and effective measures to eliminate the use of unilateral coercive measures against developing countries, as well as the declaration of non-aligned movement on condemning unilateral coercive measures and urging their elimination to ensure the effectiveness of national response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The preservation of peace should be our most urgent goal in view to the present global context. We also welcome the adopted General Assembly resolution entitled United Response Against Global Health Threat, COVID-19, as well as comprehensive and coordinated response to the coronavirus disease pandemic, the international cooperation to ensure global access to medicine, vaccine, and medical equipment to face COVID-19, as well as the global solidarity to fight the coronavirus disease in 2019. We also welcome the World Health Assembly Resolution 73.1 on COVID-19 response, date of 15 May 2020, which, inter alia, expressed deep concern about the serious risks posed to all countries, in particular developing and least developing countries, and notable African countries, and a small island developing state, recognized that the COVID pandemic required a global response based on unity, solidarity, and renewable multilateral cooperation. Also stressed the necessity of urgent short-term action to switch delivery of medical supply, especially diagnosis tool, treatment, medicine, and vaccine, and strongly urged states to refrain from promulgating and applying any unilateral economic, financial, or trade measure not in accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations that impede the full achievement of economic and social development, particularly in developing countries. We request relevant international and regional actors to rapidly scaling manufacturing and strengthening supply chain that promote and ensure fair, transparent, equitable, efficient, and timely access to and distribution of preventing tools, laboratory testing, reagents and supporting material, essential medical supplies, new diagnostic, drug, and COVID-19 vaccine, with a view to making them available to all those in need, in particular in target countries affected by unilateral coercive measures and developing countries. States must refrain from adopting unilateral coercive measures that breach the human rights obligation under Treaty of Customary International Law, and to adopt measures ensuring that the essential supplies, such as medicine and food, are not used as tools for political pressure, which constitute crimes against humanity. We seize this opportunity to call for the complement and immediate lifting of unilateral coercive measures in order to ensure the full, effective, and efficient response of all members of the international community to the COVID-19. Global solidarity and international cooperation are the most powerful weapons in fighting and overcoming COVID-19. Global threats and global challenge require a strong and global response. Facing the virus, we should enhance solidarity and get this through together. We call on all parties to put aside the difference and to concentrate on facing the emergency and its serious consequences in the immediate future. We should stay true to multilateralism and safeguard the international system with the United Nations at its core. Global governance should be based on the principle of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefit so as to ensure that all countries enjoy equal rights and opportunity and follow the same rule. This is the joint communique, and thank you for all the countries who signed with us this communique. Now I give the floor to Ms. Dalila. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Before finishing, we might want to try again with the ambassador, Iranian ambassador from Geneva. If he can connect this time, we will ask him to.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Please go ahead.
Okay, great.
But we cannot see you.
Really?
That's okay.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. Dear co-chairs, I thank you for this very timely initiative. And to reciprocate your generosity in giving me the floor at these late hours, I will shorten my statement. You have already learned about the Geneva perspective on UCMs by listening to the Special Rapporteur, Madame Duhan, and South Center's Executive Director, Dr. Correa. Much has been said about the negative impacts of UCMs on the enjoyment of human rights, and still more remains to be said. What matters most, however, is how could we make a change on the ground? How could the international community forge a general understanding in objection to the UCM? How could we sensitize the general public, especially in the West, about the gravity of the humanitarian consequences of unilateral sanctions? Here I offer some observations as food for thought. First, the critical need for public awareness raising, especially in developed countries, about the negative impacts of UCMs on human rights in developing countries. Western mainstream media are both reluctant and reductive to talk and write on UCMs in support of their state's established policy to justify unilateral sanctions, either as a lawful tool to tame their adversaries, or, and this is simply very untrue and outrageous as much as it has been convincing to their public, to present it as the lesser of two evils, to prevent war. Almost all West-based international human rights NGOs, such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, fully comply with this state policy and rarely even raise an eyebrow about the impacts of unilateral sanctions on human rights. Second, the imperative of alerting the developing states about the medium and long-term effects of UCMs on their development, and of highlighting unilateral sanctions as a contributing element to economic divide between the North and the South. The fact that unilateral sanctions have almost always been applied by developed countries against the developing countries is by itself very telling. The UCMs should be recognized as a serious man-made obstacle for realizing the goal of leaving no one behind. In fact, unilateral sanctions are pushing millions of people in developing countries behind. We are all in the same boat, and that we need to show insight and solidarity. Third, the key role of networking between and among relevant stakeholders to bring our discourse to the fore should be recognized. We need to forge synergies not only between the UCM and related human rights mandate holders, but equally important also between the UCMs and relevant international organizations such as WHO, ILO, UNHCR, UNESCO, UNCTAD, UNICEF, FAO, and others that are concerned in one form or another with the overall situation of everyday living condition of human beings. I thank you, Madam Co-Chair.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. With this, we have reached the end of this program today. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank all of you for your participation. We will continue pursuing the objectives of this seminar in every opportunity we may find in our path within this multilateral arena. Again, thank you so much for your participation, and we wish you all a very good day. Thank you.